The first sign of trouble was when my Wi-Fi dropped dead in the middle of a conference call. 1 second I was presenting the quarterly numbers, the next my screen froze and I got kicked out. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but when I stepped outside, I saw 2 guys in fake-looking uniforms crouched by the side of my house, cutting into the cable box. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, jogging over. One of them, a skinny guy with a patchy beard, stood up and flashed a badge that looked like it came from a dollar store. "Official HOA enforcement, sir. Routine maintenance. I'm Lucas Allen, not exactly the kind of guy who buys into cheap lies." I crossed my arms. "Since when does the HOA have a police force?" Before either could answer, a familiar shrill voice cut through the air. "Lucas, cooperate with them. You've been warned about your unauthorized modifications." I didn't even have to turn around to know it was Sharon Templeton, the HOA president and reigning queen of chaos. Middle-aged, bleach blonde bob, and always wearing a tracksuit like she was about to run a marathon she never entered. "There's no unauthorized anything, Sharon," I said. "This is my internet line. You can't touch it." She clucked her tongue like she was scolding a toddler. "If you read the new guidelines I sent out, you'd know all modifications to exterior utilities must be approved by the board." I stared at her. A router is not a modification. The fake cops didn't wait for more arguing. They yanked the rest of the cable free, tossed it into a battered white van with no plates, and peeled off down the street. Sharon gave me a smug little wave and sauntered back to her house without a care in the world. I stood there, fuming. I wasn't about to let this go. I pulled out my phone and checked the security camera footage. Got a perfect shot of their van, their faces, even that fake badge. If Sharon thought she could send her little goons to destroy my property, she was about to learn she picked the wrong guy. I spent the rest of the afternoon scrubbing through the footage, grabbing every detail I could. There was a partial phone number printed on the side of the van, just faded enough to be hard to read, but not impossible. I called in a favor from my buddy who worked at the county office. After a little back and forth, he found a match. The van was registered to a company called Neighborhood Compliance Solutions, which didn't exist anywhere online. Big red flag. I decided to follow the trail myself. The next morning, I waited on my porch with a thermos of coffee, watching for any sign of the van. Sure enough, around 9, it rolled right past my house again, heading down the hill. I jumped in my truck and tailed them, keeping a couple of cars behind so they wouldn't notice. They drove across town, way out past the suburbs, to a shabby industrial park. I parked across the street and watched as they unloaded a bunch of stolen-looking equipment into a dingy warehouse. The best part? Sharon's bright blue Lexus was parked right out front. Now I knew for sure this wasn't some rogue operation. This was Sharon's scam, and I was going to blow it wide open. I sat in my truck for another 15 minutes, gathering my thoughts. Charging in blindly wouldn't do any good. I needed undeniable proof. Across the street, the warehouse door remained cracked open just enough for me to catch glimpses of activity inside. I pulled out my phone, switched the camera to video mode, and zoomed in. Inside, a couple of those fake uniformed guys were sorting through piles of confiscated property satellite dishes, routers, wiring, even solar panels. They were tossing the items into labeled bins: resale, scrap, and repair. It was clear as day. Sharon and her hired muscle weren't enforcing anything. They were stealing from homeowners under the guise of HOA authority and selling the goods off. I needed backup. Real backup. I called Officer Ramirez, a guy I used to coach Little League with. He had made detective last year and owed me a favor. I kept my voice low. "Ramirez, you busy?" "Depends. You in trouble?" "Not yet. But if you want to bust up a major racket, meet me at the old Greystone Industrial Park. Bring someone from property crimes." There was a pause before he answered. "Give me 20 minutes. I hung up and kept the camera rolling. A few more cars pulled up, beat-up sedans, a couple of pickups. People in plain clothes walked in carrying more boxes of electronics. It wasn't just Sharon's crew, they had a whole network. When Ramirez's unmarked cruiser pulled into view, a second squad car wasn't far behind. I flagged them down and handed over my phone. "Warehouse across the street," I said. "It's a chop shop for stolen home equipment. Caught them vandalizing my property yesterday." Ramirez scrolled through the footage, his eyebrows climbing higher with each second. He nodded toward Officer Patel, one of the cops from the second car. "Stay here. We'll handle it." I watched as they crossed the street, guns drawn but low. They moved fast, slipping through the open door like wolves through tall grass. Shouts erupted from inside. Metal clanged. Footsteps pounded against concrete. Within 5 minutes, they had a half-dozen people handcuffed and sitting on the curb. Sharon was among them, her face flushed an ugly shade of red. Gone was the smug confidence. She looked like someone who just realized the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Ramirez waved me over. "You're gonna want to hear this," he said. One of the arrested guys, a wiry man with a scar running down his jawline, was singing like a canary. According to him, Sharon had set the whole operation up after getting voted HOA president 2 years ago. She'd quietly rewritten the community guidelines, sneaking in obscure clauses about utility compliance and external hardware regulation. Most homeowners didn't notice, trusting the board to act in good faith. Once the fake guidelines were in place, Sharon hired ex-cons and drifters to pose as HOA enforcement officers. They'd target houses with visible installations, satellite dishes, external Wi-Fi boosters, even decorative lighting, claim they were non-compliant, and confiscate the equipment immediately. The stolen goods were then funneled through shell companies, laundered, and sold online through fake storefronts. Sharon and her inner circle raked in tens of thousands of dollars while homeowners were left footing the bill for replacements. "She's cooked," Ramirez said, shaking his head. "Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. Probably looking at 20 years minimum if the feds get involved." I leaned against the cruiser, feeling the tension start to bleed out of me. "Good," I said. "She deserves every second." Before they loaded Sharon into the back of the cruiser, she locked eyes with me. Hatred, pure and venomous, radiated off her, but she didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She knew this was over. Later that afternoon, the neighborhood buzzed like a kicked beehive. Residents gathered in driveways, swapping stories, piecing together the full scope of Sharon's scheme. Turns out I wasn't the only victim. Nearly 50 homes had been hit over the past year, some multiple times. People had been gaslit into thinking it was their own fault, that they'd failed to read the updated regulations properly. The HOA board, what was left of it, called an emergency meeting at the community center. I showed up with a copy of my security footage and a printed timeline of everything I'd uncovered. By the time I finished presenting, the room was dead silent. An elderly man from the finance committee, Mr. Halverson, stood up, his voice shaking with fury. "I move to dissolve the current HOA leadership effective immediately and appoint an independent auditor to review all financial activity from the past 3 years. The motion passed unanimously. As people filed out, some stopped to clap me on the back, thanking me for exposing the rot. Felt good, but I wasn't done yet. The next week, a team of forensic accountants combed through the HOA's records. They found that Sharon had been siphoning off dues into dummy accounts, paying her fake officers under the table, and even funding her personal vacations to luxury resorts. The state attorney general's office got involved. Indictments started rolling in, not just for Sharon, but for 4 other board members who had looked the other way in exchange for kickbacks. Meanwhile, the residents decided to overhaul the HOA charter completely. We rewrote the bylaws from the ground up, installing strict oversight measures, term limits, and mandatory transparency for all financial transactions. No more backroom deals. No more unchecked authority. I didn't run for any official position myself. I was content knowing I had done my part. But they did ask me to chair the new Compliance Oversight Committee, a group designed to keep any future leadership honest. I agreed on one condition. No fake cops. Ever. The room burst into laughter. A few months later, the neighborhood looked different. People actually smiled at each other again. Kids played in front yards without their parents nervously glancing over their shoulders. Homeowners started organizing block parties, movie nights, even a community garden. The fear that had once hung over us like a thundercloud was gone. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip below the skyline, Ramirez pulled up in his cruiser. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed. "You know," he said, "you could have just reported the cable cutting and left it at that." I shrugged. "Where's the fun in that?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, you definitely made an impression. The DA's office is thinking about making your case a training example for spotting HOA corruption." I raised an eyebrow. "Glad to be of service." As Ramirez drove off, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a rare sense of peace. Sharon and her cronies were facing serious prison time, the neighborhood was thriving, and the so-called HOA cops were now real inmates in real uniforms. Justice, as it turned out, was best served with a heavy dose of patience, persistence, and a good security camera. 2 weeks after the arrests, things were finally starting to settle. But the deeper the auditors dug into Sharon's little empire, the more disturbing things they uncovered. It wasn't just theft and fraud, there were serious privacy violations too. It turned out Sharon had authorized illegal surveillance on dozens of homeowners. Hidden cameras tucked into decorative bushes, fake utility inspections where her thugs would rifle through people's mailboxes, even unauthorized access to private security systems using stolen passwords. The warehouse raid had yielded hard drives packed with personal data, bank statements, medical records, even confidential work files. The state attorney general's office elevated the case to a full-blown criminal enterprise investigation. Federal agents swooped in to seize everything left behind. HOA servers, financial ledgers, even Sharon's personal devices. I had thought I was done with it all, but when the lead federal investigator, Special Agent Reardon, asked to meet me at the community center, I agreed. When I walked in, Reardon was already seated at one of the folding tables, a thick manila folder open in front of him. He was older, mid-50s maybe, with steel gray hair and a build like a linebacker. His handshake was firm. "Lucas Allen, right?" he said. "Appreciate you coming in." I pulled out a chair. "You found more?" He nodded, sliding a handful of photographs across the table. They showed screenshots of spreadsheets, transaction logs, and detailed notes. "This isn't just local," he said. Sharon was part of a network of corrupt HOA officials operating across 3 counties. They coordinated property seizures, illegal fines, and surveillance activities. In some cases, they even forced homeowners into foreclosure over fabricated violations, then purchased the properties through shell companies. I felt my stomach tighten. "And nobody caught this before?" Reardon tapped the folder. "They were smart. Kept the amount small enough to avoid state reporting thresholds, used dozens of fake names, and intimidated residents into silence." You blowing the whistle cracked it wide open. He leaned back, studying me. "We're building a RICO case. Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It's usually for organized crime, but it fits here. We'll be indicting not just Sharon and her inner circle, but everyone involved across the wider network." I glanced at the photos again. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony," he said. "You're the initial complainant, the one who can establish the pattern of abuse and fraud. Your evidence led to the first arrests." I agreed on the spot. The following month was a whirlwind. I sat for depositions, helped federal agents map out the timeline, and even walked them through the neighborhood, showing where the fake inspections and illegal surveillance had taken place. They were thorough, pulling up every stone, no matter how small. Meanwhile, the community itself underwent a transformation. Without the fear Sharon had cultivated, people started to breathe again. A volunteer committee formed to help repair the damage left behind, rewiring homes, reinstalling legitimate security systems, offering free workshops on legal rights for homeowners. One evening, I was fixing a section of my fence when a woman I hadn't met before wandered up the driveway. She was in her 30s, wearing scrubs splattered with faint traces of paint. "You're Lucas, right?" she asked. "I'm Dr. Emily Kerrigan. I just moved in a few streets over." I wiped my hands on a rag. "Welcome to the neighborhood. Sorry you had to move into the middle of this mess." She smiled, a little wry. Actually, I heard about what happened before I bought. Figured any place with people willing to stand up like that was worth living in. We chatted for a while, and it turned out she was helping organize a legal defense fund for residents who had been financially ruined by Sharon's schemes. Some families had lost tens of thousands of dollars fighting fraudulent liens and fines. Others had spent years battling bogus violations. Word spread quickly, and within days nearly every homeowner had contributed. Even small donations added up. We raised enough to hire an independent legal team to represent affected residents in a civil suit against the old HOA board. The lawsuit named Sharon, her fake officers, the shell companies, and even the banks that had turned a blind eye to the fraudulent foreclosures. It was aggressive, and it had teeth. During the discovery phase, our attorneys uncovered even more damning evidence. Sharon had kept a secret ledger detailing Target's high-value homes she intended to force into foreclosure. She had even written notes about which residents were weak-willed or easily intimidated. The public outrage was volcanic. By the time the federal indictments were unsealed, the media had latched onto the story. News vans lined the streets. Reporters knocked on doors, hungry for interviews. A few residents agreed to speak on camera, sharing heartbreaking stories of harassment, financial ruin, and betrayal. I stayed mostly out of the spotlight, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. But when a local journalist asked to do a feature on how the community had rallied together, I agreed under one condition: that they focus on the neighborhood, not me. The article painted a vivid picture of resilience, and for once, the headlines weren't about scandal but about recovery. Meanwhile, Sharon sat behind bars, denied bail after prosecutors revealed she had tried to wire money overseas and flee the country. Her trial date was set, and the prosecutors intended to make an example out of her. The day the trial started, the courthouse was packed. I sat near the front, just behind the prosecution's table, flanked by neighbors who had also come to bear witness. Emily sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The federal prosecutor laid out the case in stark, brutal detail. A deliberate pattern of abuse, theft, and intimidation spanning years, with Sharon at the center. One by one, victims took the stand. They spoke of sleepless nights, lost homes, and destroyed savings. Some cried. Others clenched their fists and forced their way through the testimony. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the witness stand and swore the oath. Facing the jury, I told them about the day my Wi-Fi was cut, about chasing down the van, about the warehouse full of stolen property. I showed them the security footage, the van registration, the financial records I had helped uncover. The defense tried to paint me as a troublemaker, someone with a vendetta. But it didn't stick. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see right through it. After 2 weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Sharon to 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Several of her co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. The shell companies were dismantled, and restitution was ordered to the victims. In the months that followed, the civil suit progressed quickly. With the criminal convictions in hand, settlements came swiftly. Banks paid out millions in damages. Insurance companies rushed to settle claims rather than risk massive judgments. The community used part of the settlement money to establish a neighborhood trust fund designed to provide legal assistance and property maintenance grants for residents in need. As for me, I went back to my life, but everything felt a little different now. There was a deeper sense of connection among the residents, a quiet understanding that we had been through something extraordinary together and come out stronger. Sometimes, as I walked the newly repaired sidewalks, I would catch someone's eye and see a small nod of acknowledgement. No words needed. Just a shared memory of what we had survived. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Emily joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one without a word and sat down. For a long while, we just watched the neighborhood come alive, kids riding bikes, dogs being walked, neighbors chatting over fences. Finally, she broke the silence. You know, she said, most people would have just gotten mad and moved away. I sipped the coffee. Most people didn't have a front row seat to how bad it could get. She smiled, not the polite kind, but a real, genuine one. Good thing you're not most people. We sat there until the stars came out, a quiet, steady reminder that sometimes, when you refuse to be bullied, you don't just save yourself, you save a whole community. A month after Sharon's conviction, things had mostly returned to normal. The subdivision that once lived under a microscope now thrived with a new sense of freedom. But there were still loose ends, and not everyone was ready to move on. One afternoon, as I repaired the gate along the side of my property, a knock sounded at the front door. Wiping my hands on my jeans, I circled around and opened it to find Special Agent Reardon standing on my porch again, this time carrying a thin black laptop bag. I figured you'd want to see this, he said. I stepped aside and let him in, leading him to the kitchen where the sunlight streamed through the windows. He set the bag down and pulled out a government-issued laptop, entering a few credentials before spinning it around toward me. What is it? I asked. Something we found buried in the encrypted files on Sharon's personal drive. Took our cyber division weeks to crack. His voice was low, serious in a way that immediately put me on edge. The screen displayed a spreadsheet labeled Priority Acquisitions. Columns listed addresses, estimated home values, lien statuses, and homeowner vulnerabilities. But what caught my eye was a tab labeled Phase 2. I clicked it open. It wasn't just about stealing equipment or forcing foreclosures. Sharon had been preparing to push legislation through local government channels that would give HOAs police-like authority, real badges, real power to enforce fines, enter homes without warrants, even dictate property sales. They call it the Community Enforcement Initiative, Reardon said, backed by a few corrupt council members. If they'd pulled it off, your neighborhood would have been just the beginning. My stomach twisted. How close did they get? He leaned back against the counter. Closer than either of us would like. Draft bills were already written. Campaign contributions were funneled through PACs to grease the right palms. They were waiting for the upcoming elections to push it through quietly. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of what could have happened. It wasn't just about Sharon stealing routers and solar panels. She had been laying the groundwork to turn entire communities into private fiefdoms backed by real law. We've already arrested 3 city officials, Reardon continued. More are under investigation. But exposure is key. The voters need to know what almost got slipped past them. I closed the laptop carefully. What do you need from me? He smiled grimly. Testify at the upcoming ethics hearings. Tell them exactly what you uncovered. Show them how dangerous unchecked HOA power can be. I agreed without hesitation. In the weeks leading up to the hearings, I worked with a team of federal attorneys and state investigators to prepare. They combed through every document, every email, every bank record tied to the operation. Meanwhile, local journalists began publishing exposés, laying bare the web of corruption that had nearly ensnared half the county. When the day of the hearing arrived, the state capitol was a madhouse. Protesters lined the steps, waving signs about HOA abuse and government corruption. Reporters jostled for position at the entrances. Inside, the main chamber buzzed with a nervous energy that thickened the air. I took my seat at the witness table, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. Across the room, a handful of council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing their careers dangled by a thread. The chairman, an older man with sharp features and a voice like gravel, called the session to order. "Mr. Allen," he said, "please proceed." I cleared my throat. "Thank you, Chairman. What I'm about to describe is not just about one corrupt HOA president. It's about a systemic abuse of power that almost became law." I walked them through it all, the fake enforcement officers, the stolen property, the illegal surveillance, the financial fraud, the secret legislation. At each point, I presented evidence, photographs, security footage, financial records, internal emails. Council members whispered among themselves, faces blanching as the full scope of the plan became clear. One of them, a woman in a navy suit, leaned forward. "Mr. Allen, in your opinion, what would have happened if this legislation had passed?" I met her gaze steadily. Homeowners would have lived under private dictatorships, stripped of constitutional protections. No right to privacy, no due process. Just fines, seizures, and surveillance, all without oversight. The room fell silent. Another councilman, younger and clearly shaken, asked, "Why didn't more people know about this sooner?" "Because the people orchestrating it were experts at keeping it quiet," I said. "They preyed on trust and apathy. It almost worked." The hearing stretched late into the evening. When it finally adjourned, the committee announced an immediate suspension of all pending HOA-related bills and launched a full investigation into every council member with ties to Sharon's network. In the following weeks, arrests continued. 2 more council members were indicted on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy. Several high-ranking city employees resigned under pressure. New laws were proposed to rein in HOA authority across the state, including mandatory transparency, third-party audits, and strict limitations on enforcement powers. Meanwhile, back in our neighborhood, things continued to flourish. The new board, composed of residents who had lived through the worst, operated with full transparency. Budgets were posted publicly, meetings were open door, and community projects replaced arbitrary fines. Emily and I grew closer, often spending evenings together working on neighborhood initiatives. One project she spearheaded was a scholarship fund for local students, funded partially by the restitution money recovered from the civil suits. One evening, as we set up chairs for a block party in the cul-de-sac, she looked over at me, a mischievous glint in her eye. "You know, for a guy who just wanted his Wi-Fi fixed, you ended up taking down a criminal empire." I chuckled, adjusting a table. "All part of the service." She nudged me with her shoulder. "Seriously, you changed things. Not just here, but across the whole state." I didn't have a ready answer for that. I just tightened the last strap on the canopy and watched as neighbors trickled in, carrying dishes and drinks, kids racing ahead with laughter echoing into the twilight. Later that night, as fireworks lit up the sky and cheers rose from the crowd, I stood with Emily at the edge of the gathering, feeling a rare and complete sense of peace. The battle had been hard, dirtier than anyone could have imagined. But in the end, we had done more than stop a scam. We had built something stronger than fear. A real community, bound not by rules or fines, but by trust and resilience. And if anyone ever tried to pull something like that here again, they would find out fast that we were no longer easy targets. Not by a long shot.